The Supreme Court of the United States stood tall under a brooding gray sky. Its marble pillars, once a symbol of unwavering justice, now felt colder, almost watching. Caroline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, stepped out of her government SUV with a calm that belied the storm brewing within. She wore a navy blazer, a white blouse, and a silver cross delicately clipped to her collar, not just an accessory, but a statement. She wasn't summoned here officially. No cameras. No podium. Just a rumor swirling through Capitol Hill that one of the latest SCOTUS rulings had buried language hostile to religious expression. And that Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest justice, had written it. President Trump's voice had been sharp on the phone that morning. Go see for yourself. If they're rewriting liberty, I want you watching it happen. So she did. Inside the rotunda, clerks whispered in corners. Reporters weren't allowed. Lawyers marched past her in hurried steps, pretending not to notice the blonde-haired woman who now embodied the new right. Caroline didn't need a court date to shake things. All she needed was her words. She walked into the public gallery of the chamber where oral arguments were wrapping up. Her eyes locked on Ketanji Brown Jackson, seated in stoic black robes, questioning a government lawyer with a voice as composed as it was lethal. Caroline took her seat quietly, phone in hand, not to record, but to take notes. She had read the ruling in question. The phrasing was subtle, but the implications dangerous. Public religious expression, framed as social disruption. That was a red flag wrapped in velvet. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Suddenly, Justice Jackson's voice changed tone. We must consider whether personal faith, displayed in overt symbols, can challenge institutional neutrality. That was it. Caroline's cross shimmered under the courtroom's light. She knew she wasn't just here to listen anymore. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, and she was ready to respond. Caroline's fingers gripped her pen tighter as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leaned forward, resting both hands on the bench. Religious expression is valid, Jackson continued, her voice calm, but when it crosses into public governance, when the symbol becomes political posture, it risks becoming coercive. The words stung. Not because they were loud, but because they echoed something deeper, a subtle accusation. Caroline had heard similar rhetoric before, coded language wrapped in legal nuance, but never from the highest bench in the nation. And never so pointedly in her direction. She felt the tension in the room thicken, like the air before a thunderstorm. The attorneys droned on, but she barely heard them now. The subtext was louder than the spoken word. Was this personal? As the courtroom took a recess, she rose from the gallery seat and made her way to the hallway, heels clicking against polished tile. A few staffers recognized her, some offering awkward nods. Others avoided eye contact. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She was a lightning rod. A voice behind her cut through the silence. Miss Leavitt. She turned slowly. A tall woman in black robes approached, Justice Jackson herself. The justices rarely left chambers during breaks, let alone approached outsiders. I assume you heard my comments, Jackson said. Not a question, a challenge. Caroline kept her tone even. Hard to miss, Justice. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Your presence here isn't unnoticed. Nor is that cross on your collar. Caroline took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch. It's not meant to provoke. It's part of who I am. Jackson's lips tightened. And yet your presence here feels performative. I've seen enough political theater this week. The insult was light, but the cut was deep. Caroline took a step closer, her voice lowering. I came to listen. You turned it into a performance, not me. A pause. Neither blinked. Then Jackson said, coolly, just remember, freedom of belief is sacred. But so is the line that keeps faith from becoming doctrine. Caroline didn't respond immediately. But as the justice walked away, she whispered, just loud enough. And what keeps doctrine from silencing faith? Justice Jackson didn't turn around. But she heard. And the war of words had officially begun. Back at the White House, Caroline sat at her desk, eyes locked on her laptop screen. The recording she'd made of the court session was crisp. Every word Justice Jackson had said now echoed from her speakers. She rewound a specific part. The symbol becomes political posture, it risks becoming coercive. She hit pause. Her jaw clenched. This wasn't just about one ruling. It was a narrative, a carefully crafted message from the highest court, suggesting that expressions of faith in the public square might soon be painted as ideological weapons. And Caroline wasn't about to let that slide. She opened a new document, typing rapidly. A speech, not for the press room, but for a conference she knew would be the perfect platform, the National Religious Liberty Forum, scheduled for Saturday in Virginia. Title: Faith Isn't a Threat, It's the Foundation. As she wrote, her assistant Michelle stepped in, tablet in hand. You've been invited onto Tucker Carlson's podcast. They want you to talk about the SCOTUS tension. Caroline didn't look up. Book it. And prep a summary of every SCOTUS case in the last 5 years where religious symbols were flagged. Michelle hesitated. Going after a sitting Supreme Court justice, that's not exactly routine. Caroline finally turned her gaze, calm but razor-sharp. Nothing about this time in America is routine. And if someone in a black robe wants to redefine faith as disruption, then we're not going to stay quiet. That night, she reread Jackson's previous rulings. Patterns began to emerge, small, almost surgical strikes in opinions and dissents that subtly reinterpreted the First Amendment. The justice wasn't sloppy, she was precise. And that made her more dangerous. Caroline closed her laptop, the weight of strategy pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting a judge. She was confronting an idea, one that said belief must retreat from public life. And tomorrow, she'd begin to fight it publicly, with names, dates, precedent, and power. Not because she wanted a battle, but because the court had just picked one with her. Saturday arrived with an electric buzz. The ballroom at the National Religious Liberty Forum in Virginia shimmered with camera lights, murmuring crowds, and the low hum of anticipation. Reporters from Fox News, Epoch Times, even a few from CNN, gathered near the media pit. They weren't just here for sound bites, they were here for a fight. Caroline Leavitt stood backstage, her speech folded tightly in her hand, though she no longer needed it. Every word was burned into memory. On the main stage, the event's host adjusted the microphone and leaned toward the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, and a woman who made the Supreme Court blink, Caroline Leavitt. Applause erupted. But it wasn't the polite kind. It was fierce. The crowd wasn't here for diplomacy. They wanted clarity. They wanted defiance. Caroline stepped forward, her navy blazer sharp, the silver cross on her collar gleaming like armor under the lights. She paused, let the noise fall, then spoke. 3 days ago, I walked into the Supreme Court to observe a case on religious liberty. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shout. I wore a symbol of my faith, just as millions of Americans do, every day. She held up a printed still frame, a frieze of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, hand raised, mid-lecture. This, she continued, tapping the image, is the face of institutional intimidation. A judge questioning whether a cross belongs in a courtroom. A courtroom. In a nation whose First Amendment begins with the words, Congress shall make no law, respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The crowd burst again into applause. Caroline leaned into the mic, her voice cooling. This isn't just about a cross. It's about whether Americans of faith are allowed to participate in public life without being told to check their beliefs at the door. That includes classrooms, boardrooms, and yes, even courtrooms. Backstage, one of the event coordinators checked her phone and nearly dropped it. Justice Jackson had just posted on X, "Religious liberty is sacred. But the courtroom is not a campaign stage. Let's not confuse faith with showmanship." The post had already hit 100,000 likes. Caroline's team rushed the phone to her as she stepped off the stage. She read the post, smiled, looks like she's watching. Then turned to the cameras and said, I guess we're not done. By Sunday morning, Washington was already ablaze. The clip of Caroline's speech had gone viral. Every angle of her holding up the printed image of Justice Jackson had circulated across social media like wildfire. Conservative influencers called her a patriot. Liberal commentators accused her of grandstanding. But none of that mattered to Caroline, because for the first time, SCOTUS had blinked, and the public had seen it. Caroline sat in a quiet conference room inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, watching the numbers climb on her phone. 10 million views in under 12 hours. But her expression stayed fixed, focused. This wasn't victory, this was escalation. A knock broke her concentration. Trump's senior advisor stepped inside, holding a tablet. "She just filed a statement with the court's Public Information Office," he said, tapping the screen. Caroline took it, scanned it. It was brief, coldly so. A formal, almost sterile response from Justice Jackson. Religious symbols are not, by default, violations of court neutrality. However, provocations that intend to politicize sacred spaces threaten the foundation of impartiality. Caroline's brow tightened. She's walking it back, but keeping the dagger in. The advisor nodded. "What do you want to do?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the window, looking out at the towering Capitol dome. "She's rewriting the rules mid-game. We can't just react anymore. We bring the court to the people." That afternoon, she called a press conference outside the Jefferson Memorial, symbolic, deliberate. She stood before a backdrop of marble columns, holding a pocket constitution in one hand and the fine image of her cross in the other. "This isn't about one judge," she began, "and it's not about me. It's about who gets to decide what counts as neutrality. Because if a simple cross is provocative, what's next? A prayer in a park? A Bible on a desk? A belief in your heart?" She paused as reporters snapped photos. "This city doesn't get to decide where faith belongs. The Constitution already did." The next morning, billboards appeared across Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. "A cross is not contempt. Caroline Leavitt." Donations surged. Conservative PACs latched on. But Caroline stayed silent. For now. Because she wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing reform. And she knew exactly where to take it next. Monday morning, a storm brewed, not over D.C. skyline, but in the halls of the Supreme Court. For the first time in her tenure, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson found herself the subject of a nationwide conversation she didn't control. Editorials spilled ink. Pundits took sides. Even NPR asked on air, "Has SCOTUS lost moral neutrality?" Inside her private chambers, Jackson read the headlines in silence. A White House spokeswoman challenges judicial authority. Faith versus jurisprudence, Leavitt's gambit. Cross or confrontation? She exhaled sharply and closed her laptop. The gavel had always been the final word, until now. Her clerk stepped in hesitantly. "Ma'am, there's a letter. From Leavitt." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "A letter? It's not public. Yet." She unfolded the crisp envelope. "Justice Jackson, this is not an attack. It's a plea. I don't question your intellect or your seat on the bench. But I do question how far interpretation can bend before it breaks the trust of those it governs. I'm not the first to wear a cross in court. I won't be the last, but I may be the first who refuses to apologize for it. Respectfully, Caroline Leavitt." White House Press Secretary. Jackson read the letter twice. No threats, no media theatrics. Just an ice-cold challenge in the language of the law. She looked up. "Draft a response," she said. "Formal, but personal." Hours later, a closed-door panel of justices convened. The topic, not just Leavitt's letter, but the entire court's perception in the public eye. Jackson spoke plainly. She called out a truth we ignored, she admitted, her tone neutral but direct. "The line between law and politics is thinning. I won't let the court dissolve into theater, but I won't pretend our robes make us immune to public accountability either." The room was silent. Meanwhile, across town, Caroline was already preparing for the next strike. A legal initiative. A public petition. A bill. The cross had been the spark. Now she was building the fire. Thursday morning. Capitol Hill buzzed with uncharacteristic intensity. The House Committee on Civil Liberties had called for an emergency oversight hearing, officially titled Religious Expression and Judicial Bias, the State of the First Amendment in Modern Jurisprudence. Unofficially, everyone knew what it was really about: Caroline Leavitt versus Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. A line of press vans snaked around the Rayburn building. Inside, the hearing room was standing room only. Congressional staffers, legal analysts, conservative activists, even curious interns pressed shoulder to shoulder. Social media lit up with a new hashtag. #CrossOnTheHill. Caroline entered the room in a tailored navy suit, her silver cross gleaming just below her collarbone. Flanked by 2 legal advisors, she carried a leather folio packed with case law, court transcripts, and her own correspondence with SCOTUS. A Democratic congresswoman from California leaned over to a colleague. "She's got the look of someone about to make history, or war." The hearing began with the chairperson's formal welcome. Then came the opening statement. Caroline adjusted her mic. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I'm not here to attack the court. I'm here to defend the people it sometimes forgets. The teachers told to remove crosses from their desks. The students banned from praying silently. The veterans fined for wearing faith pins in city council meetings. If one symbol of belief triggers this much fury from the bench, the problem isn't the symbol. It's the fury." She continued for 7 minutes, weaving legal precedent with personal experience. She cited Tinker versus Des Moines, Church of Lukumi Babalu, and even Jackson's own dissent in a lesser-known case from 2023. She wasn't just speaking. She was prosecuting an idea. Opposing voices pushed back. A law professor argued the court must draw lines to prevent coercion in public institutions. A progressive activist accused Leavitt of weaponizing faith to advance political goals. Caroline didn't flinch. "My faith isn't a weapon," she said quietly, "but it is a shield. And when that shield is targeted, I have every right, no, every duty, to defend it." By the end of the hearing, even some committee members who entered skeptical were nodding. Not necessarily in agreement, but in respect. Outside, the press swarmed. "Did you expect this backlash, Caroline? Is this about faith or power? What happens next?" She paused, then smiled slightly. Now we take it to the people." The very next day, Ketanji Brown Jackson walked into the National Bar Association's annual conference with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Her keynote speech had just been rewritten, personally, after watching Caroline Leavitt's testimony the day before. The ballroom was packed. Cameras from C-SPAN, CNN, and independent legal media buzzed in anticipation. The Supreme Court rarely spoke in unofficial capacities, but today Justice Jackson was making an exception. She adjusted her black robe slightly, approached the podium, and paused. The air held tension, electric and raw. "We are not in a court," she began, her voice smooth but cutting. "We are in a country that increasingly confuses personal defiance with constitutional integrity." The audience fell silent. "Let me be clear, defending your beliefs is your right. But undermining public trust in our institutions, by framing yourself as a martyr of freedom while knowing full well the legal nuances you ignore, is not heroic. It's dangerous." Gasps from the press gallery. Was she directly referencing Caroline? Absolutely. Jackson's tone sharpened. "The courtroom is not a stage. Judges are not villains. And the First Amendment, while powerful, does not give anyone a blank check to override the structure that protects us all." She cited 3 cases that had been misquoted during the Hill hearing, including Tinker versus Des Moines, turning Leavitt's interpretation on its head. Then, without ever naming her opponent, she dropped the line that would dominate the headlines. "There is a difference between wearing a cross and weaponizing it." The room stirred. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Online, the quote went viral. Hashtag weaponizing faith began trending on X. But outside the legal crowd, the backlash was immediate. Conservative influencers accused Jackson of attacking Christian expression. Protesters began organizing outside the Supreme Court building. News pundits speculated, was this a judicial overreach? Was Jackson politicizing her robe? Back in her office, Caroline watched the replay. She leaned back, arms crossed, then said to her aide. So that's how she wants to play it? Fine. She just made it personal. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after Justice Jackson's "weaponizing the cross" comment, Caroline Leavitt stood before a massive American flag backdrop at the Liberty Forum in Dallas, Texas. The room was packed with conservatives, veterans, and religious leaders. Camera crews elbowed each other for the best angle. Everyone knew this wasn't just another political speech. This was retaliation, dressed in patriotism and constitutional resolve. Caroline stepped up to the podium, the silver cross on her collar catching the spotlight like a deliberate challenge. She waited for the applause to fade before speaking. Last week, I stood up for my First Amendment rights in a courtroom. This week, a sitting Supreme Court justice suggested I weaponized my faith. Gasps from the crowd. Some murmured. Some jeered. Let me be clear, she said, her voice steely, I didn't walk into that courtroom with a weapon. I walked in with a symbol, a reminder of who I am and what I believe. If a small silver cross is more disruptive than bias behind a bench, maybe the robe isn't hiding neutrality anymore. The audience erupted in cheers. Faith isn't theater. It's identity, she continued. And when the highest court in our land treats belief like a threat, that's not justice. That's intimidation. She paused, then brought up the crowd-favorite line. If wearing a cross is now an act of rebellion, then mark me guilty. Because I will not apologize for believing in God and the Constitution, in that order. The hashtag marked guilty began trending before she even stepped off the stage. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Tucker Carlson retweeted the quote. A dozen congressmen pledged support. Trump himself posted. Caroline Leavitt, brave, brilliant, unbeatable. The left fears her because she speaks truth. But not everyone cheered. Legal scholars argued her rhetoric was spinning dangerously close to populism at the expense of judicial credibility. Jackson's defenders called it an emotional stunt. Meanwhile, Caroline's team was already working on the next step, drafting a proposal called the Faith in Courts Act, a legislative counterstrike that would force transparency on courtroom fines related to religious symbols. This wasn't just a clash anymore. It was a campaign. 3 weeks later, the marble steps of the U.S. Capitol were flooded with thousands. Evangelical pastors, Catholic nuns, Orthodox Jews, and even Muslim and Sikh leaders stood side by side, not because they shared every belief, but because they all believed in one thing, freedom to believe. At the center of it all was Caroline Leavitt. Standing behind a podium marked with bold letters. Faith is not contempt. The Faith in Courts Act was now a real bill, co-sponsored by 37 members of Congress. The legislation aimed to mandate courtroom transparency, prohibit religious bias in dress code enforcement, and create an oversight panel for judicial conduct. The atmosphere felt like the March on Washington, except this time, it wasn't civil rights based on race, but belief. Caroline raised her voice over the roar of applause. Let it be known, this isn't about me. It's about every man or woman who walked into a courtroom and was told to hide who they are. It's about the grandmother fined for her rosary beads. The student mocked for his yarmulke. The mother silenced for praying before a custody hearing. The crowd grew louder. They called me a threat. A disruptor. They tried to turn my belief into something dangerous. But we turned it into something powerful. Because when one voice speaks truth, others find theirs too. From a nearby window at the Supreme Court building, Ketanji Brown Jackson stood silently, arms crossed. The backlash against her speech had been fierce. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't blind to the movement her words had ignited, either. Inside her office, a draft memo titled, "Internal Review of Symbol Bias Across Lower Courts," lay open. Change was coming, even if it wasn't on her terms. That night, Caroline appeared on national television. The host opened with, "You went toe-to-toe with the highest judge in the land," and the country followed. "What's next?" Caroline smiled slightly. "I didn't set out to pick a fight. I set out to defend a principle. And if defending it means fighting, then I won't back down." Social media exploded again. #FaithIsNotContempt climbed into global trends. Even moderate networks admitted, she may be young, but she knows how to move the system. From a courtroom fine to a national firestorm, Caroline had done what few could, forced the country to confront its blind spots, and sparked reform not with fury, but with conviction. The cross on her collar wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a symbol that changed the law. 3 weeks ago, I was told that my faith was a disturbance. That wearing a cross in a courtroom somehow made me unfit to be heard. But today, look around you. Faith didn't divide us. It brought us here. Kalabalik Al-Kisler. This moment isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about reminding America that liberty doesn't mean silencing beliefs, it means protecting them. Whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, or none of the above, your place in a courtroom, in a classroom, in this country, is equal. They said I broke decorum. I say I broke denial. Sessizlik. Ardindan Yükselen Al-Kisler. To every young woman watching who wonders if she's too small to be heard, too faithful to be accepted, too different to belong, let me tell you this. You don't need permission to stand up. You need conviction. The Constitution gave you the rest. I walked into that courtroom alone. But I stand here with millions. So let this be the last time anyone in this country is fined for believing. And the first time the system is reminded. We don't hide our values, we live them. Thank you. God bless you. And may freedom, in all its forms, never be silenced again.